If you leave here today and you don't remember anything that I say and you don't think, or you think the thumb thing was stupid, or I don't care what you do, here's what I want you to remember. How you think affects how you act. And if you're willing to change your thinking, if you're willing to break some unwritten rules, what will happen is that your performance will go up. So what we're going to do the rest of this session is we're going to try and look at a process, a system on how to break rules. And by the way, I wish I could tell you that this was rocket science. I wish I could tell you that I'm incredibly intelligent and that I'm the only one that has ever figured this out. But it's really not that complex. The challenge, though, is in your brain dealing with two words. The words are this: simple and easy. When we teach on a regular basis, we get these words confused. I'll give you my favorite example. Anybody in here remember taking algebra? Do you ever have a teacher stood up in front of you and they went like this? Today we're going to talk about quadratic equations. This is really easy. How many of you found it was just not as easy as she said it was? Well, here's the problem. Simple is a word that talks about level of technical complexity. To be honest, this process that you're looking at, there's only 3 parts to it. Recognize, rewrite, and reinforce. That's just not that complicated. But here's the challenge. Simple is talking about level of technical complexity. Easy is a word that talks about level of comfort. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to judge you on this, but what I'm telling you is significant and important. This process is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And yet, if you want to grow, you're going to have to change. We hate change. We are creatures of habit. Let me see if I can show you what it's going to feel like as you go through this process if you're not careful. And for this to work, I need your help again. If you would do me a favor, just sit up straight where you are for a second. And if you would, just put your hands up in the air like this. Okay? Now, take your hands and clasp them in front of you. Take a second and look at your thumbs. How many of you in here have the left thumb on top of the right thumb? Okay, how many have the right thumb on top of the left thumb? Okay, how many are not sure? A little bit too long at the Wild Horse last night, I'll tell you. All right, put them up in the air again. Put them back together again. Look at your thumbs again. How many of you have the exact same thumb on top? Now, this is an example of a pattern. So let me show you what change feels like if you're willing to try this simple process. Sit up straight, hands up in the air. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say together. When I say together, put your hands together. Then I'm going to say apart. I'm going to do that twice. The third time, I'm simply going to say switch. When I say switch, all I want you to do is put your hands together, but put the opposite thumb on top. Everybody ready? Let's see what happens. Together, apart. Together, apart. Switch! Marty Pyle's in the front going like this. That's wrong. I always like this because I usually run into 3 kinds of people. I do get a lot of people that get it right the first time. Then I get the switchers. They go like this. Yes! Oops. But my all-time favorite, every once in a while I get people that I just totally confuse and I go switch and they go like this. I can't quite figure it out. So let's go ahead and get started and let's go through this process. The first thing that you have to do is you have to understand and recognize that unwritten rules exist. I don't know what they are, but I do know that they exist. And I'm going to suggest, not so much here, but as you go through the rest of this conference, that you spend some time talking with people and say this: what are the unwritten rules that are affecting me? Because the very first step in breaking an unwritten rule is you have to accept that it exists. You have to understand what it is. I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you that they do exist. And step number 1, you got to figure out what they are. Step number 2, this is where you start rewriting. And I always like this. I call it the antithesis hypothesis. And it sounds really silly, but really is looking at what the rule is and then saying, well, I can do it. And from that, you just go to, or I can't, then you go to I can. It's simply looking at the situation and turning it upside down. So now, what's the last step? And the easiest way to understand the last step is going to be by telling you a story. A story about me and a story about hiking. Do I have any hikers here? Okay, I'm a big hiker. I hike up in New Hampshire. We have beautiful mountains, the White Mountains. We also have some of the most dangerous hiking trails in the country. So far this year, there have been 3 deaths up on Mount Washington. Part of the reason it's so radical, part of the reason it is so dangerous, is because the weather is pretty bad. Up until 3 years ago, the world record for wind speed was held by Mount Washington, 273 some odd miles per hour. That's fast. So let me tell you a little bit about what I do. I hike. I've been hiking in 3 seasons for years, and several years ago I got the bug to hike during the winter. I enjoy doing it, but I will tell you that in many instances it's pretty radical. 2 weeks ago I was on Mount Moosilauke. It's about 5,200 feet, a little bit less than Mount Jefferson, but the temperature was 2 degrees and the wind speed was 45 miles an hour. Someone once looked at me and said I was stupid. I understand that. But what I've done in my mind is I've broken some unwritten rules and said I really enjoy that. And I'll tell you the reason I enjoy it, because I got good gear. And to be honest, when you try hard things, if you got good gear, it's not that bad. When I was on Moosilauke, completely comfortable. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because one of the things that happened as I was climbing Mount Jefferson, and so you understand the scenario, it's not 2 degrees, it's about 17 degrees. It's a clear blue sky. It's beautiful, the sun is out, but it's 17 degrees and there's a 35 mile an hour wind. And it's about a 14-mile hike. Yeah, she's like, no, I don't like to do that. 14's not that bad, but here's what happens. It's 14 miles on a pretty gradual slope until you hit the cone. And the cone is roughly 3/4 of a mile, pretty much straight up. You need crampons, you need snowshoes, so you recognize, you probably can't tell, but looking at it, I'm carrying about a 45-pound pack. Someone once asked me, why are you carrying so much? It's pretty easy. When you go in the White Mountains, you want to have enough gear that if there's an emergency, you don't die, which is a good thing. So I've got a sleeping bag, and I've got a tent, and I've got all these different things, and here's what happened. I'm going up, and I'm having a great time until I hit the cone, and all of a sudden, I found myself doing this. This is stupid. I don't need to make the top. I hate this. This is stupid. And it hit me that the problem was that I had bought into some unwritten rules. And the unwritten rule was I didn't need to make it to the top, and the unwritten rule was this is stupid. So the very first thing that you have to do after you recognize and after you rewrite is you need to reboot the hardware. You need to reprogram your mind. You need to figure out a way to change the self-talk. So the very first thing I had to do is I had to change and figure out a way to reinforce what it is that I need. So here's what I do, and this sounds really silly and very simple, not easy, is I started doing this. I can do this. I can do this. I really like this. And it sounds crazy, but what it does is it totally changes the conversation in your mind. You see, you've got to recognize the problem. You need to rewrite, but then in some way you need to reinforce it. Because the reality is I'm cold. The reality is it's steep. And the reality is if I'm not careful, I'm telling myself this. I don't need to do this. So one of the things that's significant and important to understand is that if you're going to break the unwritten rules, you got to recognize them. You got to figure out how to reboot and rewrite. But as significant as all of those things are, you have to go through and reinforce. And you reinforce by finding people that will come alongside you. You reinforce by taking baby steps. You reinforce by changing your self-talk and how you think. Somebody once asked me, so what are you trying to tell me? Well, here's what I'm trying to tell you. If you think the way you've always thought, you're going to act the way you've always acted. If you act the way you've always acted, you're going to get the results that you've always got. So we can go to conferences like this. You can go to Tony Robbins. You can get pumped and motivated. By the way, I always tell people when they introduce me, don't introduce me as a motivational speaker. Because you see, motivation doesn't come from a speaker. In fact, it's the kiss of death if you're a speaker. Because as soon as they say I'm a motivational speaker, half of you go like this, all right, bring it on. See, that's not my job. My job is to cause you to think, to begin the questioning process, to look at what are the unwritten rules that you're living by right now, and how can I change them?